Today on Inside the Issues, we talk with Paul Heinbecker on Canadian foreign policy. Our guest today is Paul Heinbecker, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and also the Laurier University Center for Global Relations Founding Director. Welcome, Paul. You've had a long career in the Canadian Foreign Service, held a number of important posts, so you have a very experiential perspective on Canadian foreign policy. And you've also recently published this important book, Getting Back in the Game, a foreign policy playbook for Canada. Let me start by asking you, when did Canada get out of the game?
I think we started to get out of the game actually in the 90s. We went through a period in the Foreign Affairs Department, as in the rest of the government, of pretty serious budget cuts. We had a deficit that had been growing basically since Prime Minister Trudeau came to office. And there was a need to get our finances under control. And in doing that, all government departments had to participate, and foreign affairs did as well. But for reasons which are not as clear to me, the impact on foreign affairs was a bit stronger. There was also a tendency, I would say, in the Chrétien government to begin to lose confidence that we could make big differences in international relations. They didn't have as much ambition for Canada, I would say, as some other predecessors. It is true, though, and that is the exception. The Axworthy agenda on human security was a very active agenda, which we carried out, and for which Canada is still known. But there was a kind of a reticence that developed. We saw that the Martin period was probably would have been a deviation from that from that tendency, but it was too short. He was too little in office to do that, although he made some significant impacts while he was in office. And then with the Harper government, we had people come to office who were not very experienced in international relations. The progressive conservatives in the Harper government hadn't been in office in 13 years, so really had very little experience. And the conservatives part, the people from the Alliance and the Reform Party side of the party, had never actually had federal office, and so had very little experience in international relations. And they were in a minority government, and they tended to see themselves as anti-liberals, so that whatever the liberals seemed to stand for, the conservatives seemed to stand against it. And I think in those circumstances, we tended to, because the liberals, they saw liberal activism as a problem, they were a bit more reticent about getting involved.
And what was their attitude towards the Foreign Service itself? Did they see the Department of Foreign Affairs as largely a liberal preserve? Was there a sense of distrust?
There's often been with prime ministers when they come to office a distrust of the public service and a distrust of the Foreign Service in particular. New brooms like to sweep clean, and not every corner thinks it needs cleaning out. Sometimes the Foreign Affairs Department has been right, and sometimes the prime ministers have been right on the substance. Prime ministers basically take the view that they've been elected to make changes, and they should be allowed to do that. But the Foreign Affairs Department thinks it's its job to bring to the government's attention the consequences of things that it's planning to do, and that it needs to speak truth to power. That does make for not necessarily a cordial relationship. Often there is conflict. Over time it usually passes as people become used to each other. It is the case with this government that the suspicion continues long into they've been in office since 2006, and there is a degree of hostility and distrust that's surprising, and that's still there.
When were we most in the game?
I'd say we were most in the game in two periods. You could start with Mackenzie King. We did make a major contribution to the Second World War, but in terms of the actual diplomacy, I think we were much in the game in the Pearson age, when Pearson was foreign minister, when he was actually a senior official and then foreign minister. We started with a standing start. Basically, we were Mackenzie King's wishes were to avoid entanglements, And Pearson took the view that sitting in the back row of the UN silently was not a policy. And he was very aggressive in getting Canada engaged. We came with lots of good ideas. Our fingerprints are evident on the UN Charter, on the GATT, which has now become the World Trade Organization, and ICAO in Montreal, and so on. There was a lot that we had done.
The North Atlantic Treaty too.
The North Atlantic Treaty, the bringing of the newly independent colonies into the UN was another significant Canadian achievement. So that was promoted by Paul Martin Sr. And the second period, I would say, was the Mulroney period. And I, as a disclaimer, I have to say that I worked for Mulroney on foreign policy. So, you know, I make that disclaimer. But, you know, by this time in his term of office, he had a free trade agreement with the United States, an acid rain agreement with the United States, an Arctic Passage agreement with the United States. He led the response of the UN to the Ethiopian famine. He was the international leader, strongest international leader, I guess I would say, in fighting the apartheid government in South Africa and in imposing sanctions. And in that process, opposing Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, Helmut Kohl, all of the big hitters. He was also significant, and this is less well known, in the unification of Germany. There was a certain point in which the unification seemed to be in the balance, with the British and the French taking the view that this was too dangerous, that they'd seen this movie before and they didn't want to have Germany united. They were just as happy to have two Germanys or three Germanys or however many there might be. And the Americans were hesitating, and it was Mulroney who was pushing on that, saying that we made promises to the Germans at the end of the Second World War and in the 50s that they would one day be reunited, and now that the opportunity was there, it was a very bad idea to break faith with them. And that advice and his efforts in that direction were recognized by Kohl. While I was ambassador in Germany, Kohl made a speech in which he said German unification owed thanks to three leaders. One was George Bush, obviously the leader of the NATO alliance. One was Mikhail Gorbachev for not using the Red Army to suppress what was happening in East Germany. And the third was Brian Mulroney for persuading people that this was the right thing to do.
Quite an achievement at a very dangerous time.
At a dangerous time.
Well, we'll be back in a moment with Paul Heinbecker to talk about Canadian foreign policy. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. You can find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Welcome back, Paul.
Thank you.
Let's talk a bit about Canadian foreign policy today. Is it fair to say that there is a Canadian foreign policy today? Do you detect any kind of theme or pattern?
Well, I detect a pattern for sure. I think that to an extent that we probably haven't ever seen before, foreign policy is being used for domestic political advantages. You know, when Trudeau was Prime Minister, he put out a foreign policy review in which he made the argument that foreign policy was the extension abroad of national policy. And Pearson, when he was Prime Minister, said foreign policy is just national policy with its hat on. In this particular government, foreign policy seems to be being put at the service of an electoral strategy that has to do with winning a majority government. So you see issues being approached from the perspective of which groups in Canada they might please, with the intent of building a majority government, building a coalition that will bring a majority government. I'm thinking, for example, of the Greeks and the Macedonians. Or the Greeks, I think the government has tended to side with the Macedonians because there may be ridings, and there may be votes to be had there where the Greek votes are probably not available. It is the case on Middle East politics also, where the government has taken frankly and strongly pro-Israel positions. It's been the case in some other ways in Quebec, for example, where we've had conceded some positions to Quebec, conceded that Quebec could represent itself as part of the Canadian delegation at UNESCO, and that was a kind of an attempt to bring around the sort of nationalists of Quebec to support the government. So that's been a constant. I think that's a pattern. A second pattern has been very tight communications. The government really has been extraordinarily careful in trying to control what was being said, to the point where it became self-defeating, I think. In Afghanistan, for example, they were this very savvy, technologically sort of knowledgeable government was losing the communications war to the guys from the Taliban, from the living in caves. The Taliban recognized that in this age all they had to do was make news to win. So, you know, once in a while they would attack Camp Julian or someplace with no prospect of success, but the media would dutifully report it. And by the time the government got around to communicating, you know, as somebody said, you know, falsehood is halfway around the world before truth gets its pants on. So there's been I think a counterproductive attempt to control the communications a lot. Another theme has been, another pattern has been that they have been, I'd say, more interested in the economic side of foreign policy than the security side, although they have invested a lot of money in the military capability. And I think they see the military capability as being a key to their foreign policy, the role we're playing in Afghanistan, which, by the way, was, of course, the initial decision to go into Afghanistan was made by the previous government. So I think those things are fairly clear. There's an attempt, there's a desire to promote democracy, and although that is much more easily said than done, as I think they're finding out, because democracy tends to flourish where it grows naturally, rather than where it's transplanted at somebody else's suggestion.
Right. Now, so you would say the current government's foreign policy is guided primarily by electoral considerations?
I would say that it's the primary consideration. They may have other objectives, but I think the electoral dimension has a stronger, greater significance with this government than probably with any previous government that I've worked for.
Now, many people often distinguish a foreign policy grounded in the so-called national interest from a foreign policy grounded in moral principle. Right. Electoral interests would not be exactly either one of those. But if you're going to look at those two categories, national interest and moral principle, first of all, let me ask you, what do you think of that distinction? Is that a distinction that actually?
Well, I think the distinction doesn't hold water. This is the values versus interests argument, and that, you know, some people they would argue that we pursue policies because of our values and at some sacrifice of our interests. And conversely, there are people who think that because we have an economic interest somewhere, we are somehow betraying an altruistic dimension of our character. But the reality is that you can't, how do you know what your interests are unless you know what your values are, unless you know what you value? And I think we do things for both reasons most of the time. We send troops abroad in part because we think that, you know, the wretched of the earth need rescuing, but we also do it to try to make ourselves more secure. We believe in liberalized trade because we think that that's part of democracy and part of the values that we hold true. On the other hand, we also know that a stronger international system makes us richer, and we're better able to afford the kind of social policies that we like to import. The same thing with human rights. You know, we try to defend the downtrodden again in sort of diplomatic terms. But we also recognize that international law is there, and for our benefit as well as for everybody else's, and that the preservation of a legal system internationally is manifestly in our interest. I don't think I can think of a single case in the 38 years that I was in the Foreign Service and in the further years in which I've been active in foreign policy, where we have sacrificed an interest for a value. I think it's just one of those arguments that, becomes a proxy for other things. Sometimes it's a proxy for whether you're pro or anti-American, or pro-American or pro-Canadian. So I think the whole idea doesn't hold a lot of water. I'd put the political partisan stuff in that same context, but I would say that it's, that's self-interest, which is.
Although you can do a better job looking like you're pursuing narrow self-interest or looking like you're promoting a larger public good. Is your sense that we're not doing the latter as well as we used to?
Well, I think in latter years we've got a foreign policy of the golden rule, which is that he who has the gold rules. And the Defense Department, which had suffered during the 90s, and which was being asked to do things which were beyond its capability, I think, really needed to be rebuilt, and the government has rebuilt it. But in the process of rebuilding it, it has sacrificed the diplomatic side. While defense was growing from about $11 billion to $20 billion in budget, foreign affairs was actually lost $180 million in its core diplomacy in the same period. So you can't have a foreign policy that's just based on military action, because that is just too narrow. That's something which the Americans are recognizing. The Mrs. Clinton has just given a statement in which she was talking about the 1,200 new Foreign Service officers that Congress has appropriated the money for. That is a huge increase in their diplomatic capability. They see the need to be able to do that. On the question of our sort of moral standing, I think our moral standing comes from two things. One is who we are, and the other is what we do. On who we are, I always got a strong hearing at the UN, a willing hearing. I never felt that people were fed up hearing me, because they recognized that Canada was a country that probably better than everybody else integrated difference. We were able to, we had people from all over the world, and we were able to take those people and harness them in some sense, to give ourselves a society and a foreign policy that were very successful. People wanted to emulate that. The other thing is that we've played a very constructive role internationally. Pearson creating peacekeeping. The first climate change conference was held in Toronto, and Prime Minister Mulroney was Prime Minister. The human security agenda of Lloyd Axworthy and the Chrétien government, the North-South work of Prime Minister Trudeau. All of these things were part of our sort of calling card. This is what our reputation was. And I think we've gotten away from that in recent years. We've tended to go in the direction of the neocon arguments about the military strength and strategic sort of strategic studies arguments about the basis of diplomacy. And I think that's gotten us away from where we naturally have been, and I think it's diminished our influence in the process.
A very sad thought. We'll be back in a moment with Paul Heinbecker. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. You can find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Paul, let's talk a little bit about our recent rather embarrassing defeat at the United Nations. Canada lost a vote for a seat on the Security Council that we all expected we would win.
Well, I thought we would win. I knew that there were problems with some of the policies that we were following, and that they were not vote getters, whatever their integral value may or may not have been. But I thought in a year in which we hosted the Vancouver Olympics successfully, in which we hosted the G8 and the G20, and in a year in which one of our competitors, Portugal, was having major economic difficulties, that this was, if there ever was a year we should win, this was it. We didn't win, and I think people need to understand the extent of the loss, because it's actually worse than it looks in two respects. First of all, in the UN, when you're running for any kind of an election, there's a lot of vote trading that takes place. You vote for me for this, I vote for you for that, and you make commitments. Countries stuck with their commitments to us in the first round of the voting. Not all of them, not enough of them, but by and large they did. We came out at 114 votes. We needed 128, so we were not that far shy of where we needed to be. On the second round, we got 76 votes. So freed from their commitments, governments began to vote basically their attitudes towards us. And their attitudes were that they would just assume that we were not on the Security Council. We didn't get
So why don't they like us?
Why don't they like us? Well, there is some people would have you believe that it's because the UN's just a bunch of tyrants, and why should we care what they think anyway? And we could take some solace from that if it were actually true. But it's unfortunately for us, it's not true. 116 of the UN members, which is to say almost 2/3 of the membership, are elected, come from elected parliaments, recognized by Freedom House, the American think tank. And so that's one thing. Countries looked at us and they formed a rather negative view. Secondly, if you agree with my thesis that you have influence in the world when you have influence in Washington, and you have more influence in Washington if you're effective in the world, if these are reciprocating sort of factors, our standing has gone down around the world, partly because it had already gone down and the vote reflected it, but partly because the vote confirmed it. It was an inescapable statement about us. And I think that will also have its impact in Washington over time. So I think that it's been quite a significant setback for us. And why didn't we win? First of all, because we had become reticent about the UN. We hadn't participated in a major UN peacekeeping operation, UN-led peacekeeping operation or military operation for a decade or so. We had made and are making a major and very costly contribution to Afghanistan. But even counting that, we don't rank better than about 15th internationally in our contribution to international peace and security. And we're not the only ones, even in Afghanistan, who are making major efforts. So I think we've done well in Afghanistan, but I think it wasn't enough, basically, to carry us through. If you look at some of the policies we've followed, if you're a small island state, there's probably nothing you care more about than climate change. We left the impression on climate change that we were indifferent to other people's interests.
Right.
And as a consequence of that, there are 38 seats. There are 38 small island states in the UN. The numbers are that you had to get 128 votes out of 192 voters. In fact, you had to get 127 because one country was not voting for whatever reason. So if you knock 38 out of that, you're starting with quite far in the hole. Then we had the policy that we implemented toward Africa, which was essentially that we were going to downgrade Africa and emphasize Latin America. In UN voting terms, that was a loss because we already got the Latin American votes, more or less all of them, previous times. And this time we lost African votes as a consequence of that. Then there was the Middle East policy, where we, and it's a bit of a red herring to say that, previous governments hadn't supported Israel. In fact, previous governments had supported Israel in its right to exist in security all the way back to 1947. What's happened with the current government is we have become exclusively pro-Israel. And that's why we lost votes to the other countries, because the Germans, for good reasons, have a very pro-Israeli posture and policy. But it's not exclusive. They retain the capacity to criticize when they disagree with policies, and they retain the sort of right to put more foreign aid into the Palestinian territories. we tended to gear back on all of those things. There was little or no criticism of Prime Minister Netanyahu's ending of the moratorium on settlements building. We had little to say about where the wall was going. We stuck with the Israeli position on the boycott and the sort of the embargo on Gaza, right up to the point that the Israelis changed it. And then we supported the new policy. So we were perceived to have become more or less an automatic supporter of the current Israeli government. So that didn't help us either. Then there was the question of relationships. We weren't managing relationships very well. We imposed visas on the Mexicans at the outset of a travel season, with enormous cost to the Mexicans, and which has engendered considerable amount of bitterness. We didn't manage the Chinese relationship very well. And all of this comes in part from disempowering the Foreign Affairs Department, whose job is to supervise the management of those kind of relationships.
And who presumably would have warned about exactly the consequences of these kinds of things.
One hopes so.
Right. We'll be back in just a minute with Paul Heinbecker and wrap up our chat about Canadian foreign policy. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. You can find us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter. Paul, let's come back to your book for a minute. You subtitle it A Foreign Policy Playbook for Canada. The story you've been telling us so far today is that the playbook doesn't work, at least the one we have, possibly even that we don't have a playbook. What do we do here?
I think we have to do two or three things. First of all, we have to want to. We have to want to get more engaged again in the world, and we want to, partly because we have a civic duty to try to make the international system work, partly because we have a national interest in making the international system work. The more the international system is legal, the more lawful it is, the more constructive it is, the more productive it is, the better off we are. So, but there's been a tendency to some extent to stand on the sidelines and watch this, and we need to get back off the sidelines and get into the game. We have assets. We've never been richer. We've never been more secure. We've never been more connected technologically. We've never been safer. The world has actually never been more cordial to us. We used to have just a two superpower world, and then we had a one superpower world. Now we're heading into a world where there are 5 or 6 power centers. It's tailor-made for an agile country with diplomatic skills, which is almost the definition of Canada. So, but we have to want to, and that's the first thing. The second thing we have to do is to get our own house in order. There are a number of things that have to be done. First of all, we have to reinvest in diplomacy. We can't keep running our diplomacy down and expect to have any impact, because those are the people who are our representatives. They're the personification of Canadian policy. They're our eyes and ears and voices internationally. We need to get more coherence. We need to stop changing foreign ministers every year or so. There's been we've been playing light switch diplomacy also, where every time there's a change in government or a change in leadership, we have a different foreign policy. We have to go back to standing for some things which are constant through our history. We have to also bring some balance to our budgeting. I'm talking about the details inside government, but nonetheless, we have to take a holistic view towards the CIDA expenditures, the D&D expenditures, the foreign affairs expenditures, and try to come up with some kind of sensible formula so that we don't underspend on any one of them and we're not necessarily overspending on any one of them. Obviously, the military is going to have the lion's share of the money because it's the most expensive. But you can, whenever you're making a decision on spending billions, you should be saying to yourself, at the margin, where is our interest best served? At the margin, where is our security most readily assured? And diplomacy right now is the place where you get the biggest bang for your buck, I would argue. Then we have to look at relations with the United States. I think we can agree that the Big Bang theory is not working, and it becomes a game of managing the relationship in a sensible sort of way. And that also raises the question of managing other relationships, one with Mexico, obviously, one with China, one with India, one with the European Union. And here you need the Foreign Affairs Department to be the manager. You need some place where somebody has a view of the whole thing, so that you don't end up with imposing visas on the virtually the day before the Minister of Foreign Affairs meets the Mexican foreign minister, in a few days or a couple of weeks before the Prime Minister meets the Mexican President. You know, somebody has to be managing the relationship and say, wait a minute, have you thought of this or that or the other thing? And that's the role only foreign affairs can play in the government, I would say. Then we have to look at some of the issues. What are the big issues that we want to take on? Well, obviously Afghanistan is one. I think the government has made a right decision, something I had advocated, in getting into deeper into training mission in Afghanistan, not just simply walking away on a date certain, but with politics uncertain. Then I think we need to do also the same sort of thing on climate change. We have to get back into playing a more constructive role. On the Middle East, we have to base our policies on international law and compassion. If you want to be principled rather than just talk about being principled, one way to assure yourself that is to base your policies on international law, leavened with some recognition that there are real people suffering on both sides, more on the Palestinian side because of the nature of the power distribution. But that is the way to be principled, rather than taking a view that because one side is a democracy or one side is an underdog kind of resistance organization, that somehow they can do no wrong.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm optimistic about Canadians. I think that judging by the students I see at Laurier, by the students I talk to across the country when I travel, these are people who really care about international relations. They want the country to get off the sidelines and to get back into the game.
And as we know, our audience here cares about international relations and Canadian foreign policy. And to them, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Paul, for your time and your insights. Look for us again next week on Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.
New brooms like to sweep clean, and not every corner thinks it needs cleaning out. Sometimes the Foreign Affairs Department has been right, and sometimes the Prime Ministers have been right on the substance. Prime Ministers basically take the view that they've been elected to make changes, and they should be allowed to do that. But the Foreign Affairs Department thinks it's its job to bring to the government's attention the consequences of things that it's planning to do, and that it needs to speak truth to power. That does make for a not necessarily a cordial relationship. Often there is conflict. Over time it usually passes as people become used to each other. It is the case with this government that the suspicion continues long into the, they've been in office since 2006, and there is a degree of hostility. The part, the people from the Alliance and the Reform Party side of the party had never actually had federal office, and so had very little experience in international relations. And they were in a minority government, and they tended to see themselves as anti-liberals, so that whatever the liberals seemed to stand for, the conservatives seemed to stand against it. And I think in those circumstances we tended to, because the liberals, they saw liberal activism as a problem, they were a bit more reticent about getting involved.
And what was their attitude towards the Foreign Service itself? Did they see the Department of Foreign Affairs as largely a liberal preserve? Was there a sense of distrust?
There's often been with prime ministers when they come to office a distrust of the public service and a distrust of the Foreign Service in particular, as some of their predecessors. It is true, though, and that is the exception. The Axworthy agenda on human security was a very active agenda, which we carried out, and for which Canada is still known. But there was a kind of a reticence that developed. We saw that the Martin period was probably would have been a deviation from that from that tendency, but it was too short. He was too little in office to do that, although he made some significant impacts while he was in office. And then with the Harper government, we had people come to office who were not very experienced in international relations. The progressive conservatives in the Harper government hadn't been in office in 13 years, so really had very little experience. And the conservative
policy playbook for Canada. Let me start by asking you, when did Canada get out of the game?
I think we started to get out of the game actually in the 90s. We went through a period in the Foreign Affairs Department, as in the rest of the government, of pretty serious budget cuts. We had a deficit that had been growing basically since Prime Minister Trudeau came to office. And there was a need to get our finances under control. And in doing that, all government departments had to participate, and Foreign Affairs did as well. But for reasons which are not as clear to me, the impact on Foreign Affairs was a bit stronger. There was also a tendency, I would say, in the Chrétien government to begin to lose confidence that we could make big differences in international relations. They didn't have as much ambition for Canada, I would say.
Today on Inside the Issues, we talk with Paul Heinbecker on Canadian foreign policy. Our guest today is Paul Heinbecker, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and also the Laurier University Center for Global Relations Founding Director. Welcome, Paul. You've had a long career in the Canadian Foreign Service, held a number of important posts, so you have a very experiential perspective on Canadian foreign policy. And you've also recently published this important book, Getting Back in the Game, a foreign policy